It wasn't a punishment from God. It wasn't a misalignment of the planets. It wasn't even strictly speaking a tragedy for the economic destiny of the survivor. It was the greatest wealth transfer in human history. A transfer not decreed by kings, not managed by bankers, not voted on by parliaments, but dictated by the merciless arithmetic of supply and demand. The mechanism was simple. The logic was brutal. The outcome was inevitable. When you remove half the chess pieces from the board, the remaining pieces do not lose their value. They become kings. This is the story of the Black Death, but not the story you were taught in school. We are not here to count the buboes. We are not here to mourn the dead. We are here to analyze the ledger of the living, to understand how a biological apocalypse broke the chains of serfdom, how it shattered the feudal model, and how it created the first true middle class in Europe. The pattern is unmistakable. The arithmetic is merciless. A society reaches a Malthusian limit, labor becomes cheap, life becomes cheap. The elites capture all the surplus. Then a shock hits, the denominator of the equation collapses. Suddenly, the peasant is no longer a beggar. He is a shareholder in a scarce commodity, his own labor. The lords tried to stop it. They passed laws, they froze wages, they branded foreheads. It didn't matter, the market always wins. The incentive is too strong. The hunger for labor is too desperate. We will look at this pattern through three specific windows in time. First, the arrival in Florence, where the financial heart of Europe stopped beating. Second, the fields of England, where the feudal contract was torn by the plowman. Third, the violent reaction of the peasants. Revolt where the elites tried to turn back the clock and failed. Then we will map the 7 stages of this labor cycle. And finally, we will look at our own demographic cliffs today. The parallels are uncomfortable. The data is converging. The only variable is timing and pain. Transition to standard narration. To understand the magnitude of the shift, we must first understand the world that was destroyed. Europe in the early 14th century was not an empty wilderness waiting to be tamed. It was a world choking on its own success. For 3 centuries, the climate had been warm, the harvests had been decent, and the population had exploded. By 1300, France had a population it would not see again until the 20th century England was teeming with nearly 6 million souls. Every scrap of land that could be plowed was plowed. They were farming the sides of steep hills. They were draining marginal swamps. The economic consequence of this density was a crushing devaluation of human life. When labor is abundant, it is cheap. If a peasant died of starvation, there were 3 more waiting to take his place for even less food. The lord of the manor held absolute leverage. Rents were high because land was scarce. Wages were low because men were plentiful. It was a golden age for the rentier class, the landowners, and the aristocracy. They could extract maximum value from the peasantry simply because the peasant had no other option. The arithmetic of the pre-plague world was an arithmetic of elite dominance driven by demographic surplus. Then came the year 1347. The Genoese galleys arrived in Messina, Sicily, carrying a cargo that would rewrite the economic laws of the continent, the bacteria. Yersinia Pestis did not care about feudal rank or royal decree. It moved with terrifying speed along the trade routes that had made the high medieval periods so wealthy, from Sicily to Genoa, from Genoa to Marseille, from Marseille to Avignon. Let us focus on our first case study, the collapse of Florence in 1348. Florence was the Wall Street of the Middle Ages. It was a city of bankers, cloth merchants, and sophisticated financial networks. It was a city that understood risk, but it did not understand this. The chroniclers of the time, most notably Giovanni Boccaccio, describe a scene that transcends mere medical disaster and enters the realm of total social dissolution. Boccaccio writes not just of death, but of the breakdown of incentive structures. In the pre-plague world, the incentive was to save, to accumulate, to pass down land to one's heirs. But when the mortality rate hits 50%, the time horizon of the entire population collapses to 0. Why save for a future you will not see? Why tend the fields for a harvest that will rot? Boccaccio observed that the citizens of Florence abandoned their property. They left their houses open. Strangers would walk into a rich man's palace, sit at his table, drink his wine, and sleep in his bed simply because the owner was dead, and the stranger expected to be dead by morning. The immediate economic impact in Florence was a paradoxical shock to prices. Initially, as panic set in, the price of food skyrocketed because the supply chain broke. The millers were dead. The bakers were dead. The carters who brought grain from the countryside were dead. Money became meaningless compared to a loaf of bread. But then a second darker phase began. As the population thinned out, the demand for basic goods collapsed, but the supply of durable goods, clothes, tools, furniture, houses remained constant. Suddenly, you had a city with half the people, but all the infrastructure. The inheritance laws became a tangled nightmare. A peasant who might have owned nothing but a tunic suddenly found himself the sole heir of a distant uncle who had owned a workshop because everyone in between had died. We see records of individuals inheriting the estates of 4 or 5 different branches of a family in the span of a single month. The concentration of tangible wealth in the hands of the survivors was instantaneous. But the most critical shift in Florence was the realization of the surviving workers. The wool guild, the arte della lana, which was the engine of the Florentine economy, suddenly found its loom silent, not because of a lack of wool, but because of a lack of hands. The wool carders, the dyers, the weavers, Ciompi, the lowest rung of the ladder, were gone. Those who remained looked at the masters and realized the leverage had shifted. For the first time in centuries, the master needed the worker more than the worker needed the master. The psychological break was absolute. The deference that had held the social hierarchy together evaporated. If you are a day laborer in Florence in 1349 and you have survived the apocalypse, you are no longer afraid of the guild master. You have seen the guild master thrown into a mass grave like a dog. You have seen the priests die just as fast as the sinners. The aura of authority was punctured. This psychological shift is the precursor to the economic shift. Once the fear is gone, the negotiation begins. And the negotiation in Florence was brutal. Wages for skilled artisans didn't just rise. They doubled. The cost of labor became the dominant constraint on the economy, reversing 300 years of history. Just like the shock in Florence, the impact in rural England would prove that no amount of tradition can withstand the forces of supply and demand. Our second case study takes us to the English countryside, specifically the years 1349 to 1351. While Florence gives us the urban financial picture, England provides the granular data of the manorial system. The English bureaucracy was obsessive. They wrote everything down. The manorial rolls give us a week-by-week account of the death of feudalism. Consider the manor of Cuxham in Oxfordshire. Before the plague, this was a profitable estate for Merton College, Oxford. The land was worked by serfs who owed labor services mandatory days of unpaid work on the lord's land in exchange for their own small plots. It was a system of extraction. The plague arrived in Cuxham in early 1349. Within months, the records show a devastation that is hard to comprehend. The reeve, the man responsible for managing the peasants, died. His replacement died. The vast majority of the tenants died when the dust settled. The college faced a crisis. The land was still there. The crops were still in the field, waiting to be harvested. But the silence was deafening. There were no serfs to order around. The few survivors knew exactly what their labor was worth. In the past, if a serf refused to work, he could be evicted, and a dozen starving men would fight for his place. Now, if the lord threatened eviction, the serf would simply laugh and walk to the next manor, where the desperate neighbor lord would offer him twice the wages and free beer. The price of threshing grain provides the clearest data point. In 1348, the cost to thresh a quarter of wheat was roughly 25 pence. By 1350, it was 4 or 5 pence, 100% inflation in the cost of labor. But the price of grain itself did not rise as fast because there were fewer mouths to feed. This meant the real wage, the amount of food a laborer could With his earnings skyrocketed, the reaction of the ruling class was predictable. They did not try to adapt. They tried to legislate reality away. In 1349, King Edward III issued the Ordinance of Laborers, followed by the Statute of Laborers in 1351. This legislation is a fascinating document of elite panic. It explicitly stated that because of the pestilence, servants were demanding excessive wages and refusing to serve unless they were paid double or triple what they had received in the 20th year of the king-size reign. The statute mandated that all able-bodied men under 60 must work. It set a maximum wage cap, freezing wages at 1346 levels. It made it a crime to offer higher wages and a crime to accept them. It was a comprehensive attempt to use the power of the state to defy the market. It failed. Completely, the manorial rolls show us the failure in real time. Lords would officially record that they paid the statutory wage to avoid fines from the king's justices. But then in the extra expenses column, or hidden in the accounts of grain stocks, they would record gifts, bonuses, or allowances of grain and clothes given to the workers. Why? Because if they didn't break the law, their wheat would rot in the field. The incentive to save the harvest was stronger than the fear of the king's law. This created a black market for labor. Plowman became a mercenary. He would sell his services to the highest bidder. The bond of loyalty between lord and serf was replaced by the cash nexus. The serfs began to accumulate cash surpluses. For the first time, the peasant had disposable income. They began to eat better. The archaeological record shows a shift in diet. After 1350, more meat, more cheese, less gruel. The disposable class suddenly had purchasing power. This shift forced the lords to change their business model. Since labor was expensive, they had to stop labor-intensive farming. They moved from arable farming, growing wheat, which requires plowing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting, to pastoral farming, specifically sheep. Sheep eat grass. They don't need wages. One shepherd and a dog can manage a flock that covers hundreds of acres. This shift to wool production would lay the foundation for England's future textile industry. But its immediate cause was the peasant pricing himself out of the grain fields, just like the failure of the Statute of Laborers in England. The long-term social friction would eventually ignite into open warfare. Our third case study is the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. This was not a chaotic riot of starving people. It was a disciplined political movement of a newly enriched class protecting its gains. By 1380, a generation had passed since the Black Death. The survivors and their children had grown used to high wages and lower rents. They had tasted freedom. They wore better clothes. They ate better food. The elites, however, were suffering from a crisis of revenue. Their expenses were rising because of the high wages they had to pay, and their income was falling because rents had collapsed due to the abundance of land. The state, fighting endless wars in France, needed money. They decided to tax the population, but they couldn't tax the land effectively, so they invented the poll. Tax a flat tax on every head. This was the spark. But the fuel was the 30 years of resentment against the labor laws. The peasants were angry not because they were poor, but because the state was trying to force them back into poverty. They were rising to defend their new economic status. When the revolt broke out in Essex and Kent, the targets were specific. They didn't just burn houses indiscriminately. They burned the manorial rolls. They burned the archives. They targeted the lawyers and the scribes. Why? Because those documents were the legal proof of their serfdom. By burning the records, they were erasing the old debts and the old labor obligations. They were formalizing the Great Reset that the plague had started. Wat Tyler, the leader of the revolt, was not a beggar. He was likely a craftsman or a former soldier. The demands he made to King Richard II at Smithfield were radical. He demanded the abolition of serfdom entirely. He demanded that all land be rented at a flat low rate of 4 pence per acre. He demanded the end of the lordship system. The king granted the demands to buy time. Then, the mayor of London stabbed Tyler, and the revolt was crushed militarily. But here's the key. The revolt was a military failure, but an economic victory. The lords realized that they could not turn back the clock. They could not enforce the poll tax. They could not enforce the statute of laborers with the same vigor. The risk of another uprising was too high. By 1400, serfdom in England was effectively dead, not by decree, but by attrition. The lords gave up. They leased out their domain lands to the peasants.